a virtual check-in to ensure that everything is on board, but we are set to begin exactly at 10 in the next 4 minutes. So bear with us while we give others just time to get on board and to check that all our equipment is functioning. Thank you for joining us. We'll start shortly.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for bearing with us as well, just while we sort out our technical difficulties. Welcome. Thank you for joining today. My name is Arina Muresan. I am a researcher with the Institute for Global Dialogue. And let me take a quick moment for some housekeeping. I have muted everyone by default to minimize any kind of disruptions. And when panelists want to talk, just click on the microphone icon on the bottom of the bar to mute or unmute yourself. And you can also choose to have your camera on or off. Please keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking, also not on video, just so we can save on some bandwidth. And the host and co-host can also assist. This session is going to be broadcast on our Facebook page. Regrettably, our YouTube channel is not able to broadcast at the same time. So what we will do is we will upload on our YouTube channel after the event. The updated program has been placed in the chat function too. And when wanting to address a question to a panelist, please use the Q&A function. The moderator may read your question out loud or will allow you to make a short comment and question from the audience. You will then be unmuted by the host or co-host, and we will also be monitoring the social media page too. Feel free to tweet about the event using the following tags at IGD_SA, at FES_South Africa, #South Africa in the world, or any of the presenters, which I will be placing on the chat as well shortly. And of course, please do be patient with us should we encounter any technical difficulties. Without further delay, let me hand over to our Executive Director for his opening remarks. Dr. Philani Mthembu, thank you.
Wait, I have to unmute. Thank you. Thank you, Arina, and thank you also, colleagues. It's really great to have everyone here for this, what we refer to at least as one of the flagship programs of the Institute for Global Dialogue, South Africa in the World. Now, what we've done in the last few years is that South Africa and the world has been a public dialogue where we've brought together several stakeholders, practitioners, non-practitioners, to discuss and look forward as the year begins and progresses at the various foreign policy challenges and opportunities that South Africa faces in that particular year. And what we normally do is that at the end of the year as an institute, we then also bring together again various stakeholders, practitioners and non-practitioners to assess whether South Africa has been able to actually achieve some of the objectives that it had set for itself at the outset of the year. The difference in 2020 with the onset of COVID-19 is that what we've done is that we've combined some of these public dialogues with your closed dialogues under Chatham House rules. So for instance, the current South Africa in the World program was preceded by a closed dialogue with various stakeholders, particularly those who have been researching very closely South African foreign policy for the past couple of years, but those who have also been practitioners in South African foreign policy. And what that has sought to do is to really look at some of the strengths, some of the weaknesses of South African foreign policy, and to see what are some of the interventions that could actually come about to strengthen the internal capacity within South African foreign policy, but also to strengthen the coordination when it comes to our foreign policy. We know that a lot of new actors are involved, or relatively new actors are involved in foreign policy. So provinces are increasingly involved, cities are increasingly involved. You've got state-owned enterprises, development finance institutes, all of these various role or institutions and actors play a role in the shaping and the implementation of South African foreign policy. But it's important to do a stock taking of the capacities that the state has, but also the capacities of non-state actors in the exercise and the practice of foreign policy. And we hope that through South Africa in the World and through some of the conversations and the insights that are gained from multiple stakeholders, that we are better able to get a sense of the strengths and the weaknesses within SA foreign policy, and to forge a way forward in navigating an increasingly complex landscape. Some of the work, because of COVID-19, the Institute for Global Dialogue has been primarily involved in research projects this year, but also working with the likes of your Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, who we are working with on South Africa in the World. So some of the projects that we have been involved in include this one, South Africa in the World, but we've also got research that is ongoing, for instance, on multilateral approaches to financing peace and security in Africa, where we're really looking at the South Africa being in the AU or chairing the AU, but at the same time in the UN Security Council. And then also looking, for instance, at Germany, who is also in a similar position within Europe, but at the same time also within the UN Security Council. How these two countries can actually play a role in boosting multilateral approaches to financing peace and security. We're also working on a diplomatic training project where we're trying to come up with a manual on diplomatic training that can be used by various actors, not only within, for instance, your Department of International Relations and Cooperation, but also other actors. Cities play a role in diplomacy. Provinces play a role. You've got non-state actors. So we're looking at various diplomatic training modules and seeing how we could better get a sense of understanding risk analysis, understanding the changing geopolitics, and inculcating strategic thinking within South African foreign policy. So that's one of the areas we've also been looking at. We've also been looking at African perceptions of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is an important initiative, obviously, and will be important also in a post-pandemic international order. So that's also been taking some of our time as an institute, but also we're also looking at the BRICS, and particularly the BRICS within the fourth industrial revolution. And lastly, what we've also been looking at since the onset of the pandemic is really reflecting on the ANC's international relations over the past 25 years. And I think, you know, just in closing and putting out a few areas that may also shape today's discussion, is that myself and senior research fellow, Mr. Francis Kornegay, wrote an occasional paper earlier in the year titled South Africa, Africa, and the Global Balance of Forces, Combining Solidarity with Strategic Action. And I felt that this piece actually fits quite nicely in terms of the theme for today's discussion, where we're really looking at, you know, between pragmatism and ideology in the exercise of South African foreign policy. And in that occasional paper, I mean, we looked at COVID-19 and South Africa's weakened domestic economic predicament, what impact this would have on our exercise of foreign policy. And in that paper, we really said that there is an unfavorable global balance of forces, which are at the present time working against progressive internationalism, as the international strategic landscape has shifted to the right, affecting both the global north and the global south. So some of these trends are not limited only to the global north, but they're taking place also amongst the global south. And we're also seeing it even among some of South Africa's fellow BRICS partners in the domestic politics. We also said that South Africa faces a challenge in minimizing the impact of this shift to the right globally and minimizing that shift within the African continent, which would place progressive forces on the defensive. Now, such an environment is essentially hostile to South Africa's national interests within Southern Africa and Africa as a whole. And we argue that solidarity, whilst it's important, solidarity on its own is not sufficient in terms of achieving South African foreign policy. Solidarity has to be backed up by material resources and actions in line with the country's strategic objectives. And what is needed is a nuanced application of solidarity backed up with the smart use of power within our international relations. We also argued that there's a need for an assessment of the state's capacity and the diplomatic tools available for implementing foreign policy priorities, and that this will enable a more coordinated approach to international relations, especially on the African continent. We looked also at, for instance, your development finance institutions, and that it would be important to coordinate South Africa's development finance, but also the sub-regional actors and the various diplomatic tracks. And that in understanding South African foreign policy, it's important to not only have a state-centric approach, but to understand the sub-national, but also the non-state actors and the important role that they play. What's important in this changing international landscape is also that South Africa will have to also look at, you know, partners such as the European Union, who are also searching for some kind of strategic autonomy in an era of America first, which means they're having also to play a balancing act between Beijing, Russia, and also the United States. Brexit is also going to be an important issue for South Africa to continue to monitor. Because it seems like you are moving, that there is a possibility of a no-deal Brexit, and that's something that must be kept in mind. But it's also important to acknowledge that South Africa has taken steps with the United Kingdom in terms of minimizing some of the impacts of Brexit. Some of the immediate foreign policy challenges that South Africa faces include Zimbabwe, includes Mozambique, It includes some of the positions we've also taken on Israel, but also monitoring the roles of Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, particularly with regards to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam project. Libya also remains high up on the agenda, and particularly looking also the role of external actors on the African continent. Western Sahara has also been an issue that has consistently made its way into various resolutions, for instance, of the African National Congress. And we saw that there was also a solidarity conference that was hosted by DIRCO on Western Sahara. So that remains also important. But with that, it is also going to be important to see how South Africa navigates its relationship with Morocco, especially with Morocco now being back within the African Union. So it's going to be important. These are some of the immediate areas that South Africa will be looking at. But also it's going to be important to look at the US-China relations and the crisis of multilateralism, the African Continental Free Trade Area. And it's important also to understand that the acceleration and accelerating the pace of regional integration is going to be one of the key strategic issues that are facing South Africa, and will help it to also navigate its relations with external actors. But in order to do this, lastly, South Africa would also have to examine its diplomatic culture, which at certain times has seen it also fear in terms of coming across in the region as a hegemon. And I think this is also one of the areas that will definitely have to be looked at in the discussion, but also looking ahead in terms of the exercise and the practice of South African foreign policy. Now, this is not to say that South Africa should, just use its economic muscle or others to simply gain influence, but its style of diplomacy has to remain consultative. It has to remain one of humility, one of partnership with its fellow neighbors on the continent. But it is important to understand that other actors acting in their interests will not always align with South Africa's strategic priorities. And therefore, it would be important for South Africa on certain issues to assert itself within the continent and globally. And with that, I think I look forward to the discussions that will be taking place today. Thank you, Arina. Thank you to the organizers, and thank you to the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung for the partnership. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Philani. So let me hand over to our event partners and sponsors, the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, Dr. Mbaso Moyo, for his quick remarks. Thank you, Dr. Moyo.
Thanks, colleagues. I hope you can hear me. For organizing this an important seminar. Thanks particularly to Dr. Mthembu and colleagues at the IGD. I think this is a very important seminar, especially now, when under the specter of contagion, I would say, nations have sort of recoiled themselves to what analysts are beginning to call COVID-19 nationalism, which is basically measures that have been implemented by individual nations to protect their interests and their people. And this sort of gravitation towards inward-looking policies is what we saw after the Great Depression in 1929, when we saw the rise of nationalism, as a result of the hardships, financial, social, and emotional hardships that were caused by the Depression. And of course, we do know that these hardships then created conditions for the Second World War. So similarly, we saw this kind of a movement towards inward-looking policies, especially in Africa, just about the end of March, where nations closed international borders to protect lives and livelihoods. But what is apparent there is that there has not been a synchronization of lockdowns and the attendant measures to protect lives and livelihoods across the SADC region and across the African continent and even globally. You know, we indeed saw pockets of solidarity in response to COVID-19. We saw Cuba send medical personnel to Italy and South Africa. We saw China sending medical equipment to Poland and PPEs to various African countries. Yet by and large, colleagues, what we saw or witnessed were countries turning themselves into fortresses and therefore excluding others. And I think the question that one may pose is this kind of COVID nationalism not setting in motion the genesis of economic protectionism? The attended question perhaps could be, does this economic protectionism or nationalism not set in motion the challenges to attempts to regional integration as seen by the Africa Continental Free Trade Area? So as FES, we were pleased to be part of a conversation that seeks to address these pertinent questions. And we believe that a conversation of this nature, especially a conversation that tries to understand the constraints that are imposed by COVID-19 on regional integration and multilateralism is important. So we thank the IGD for inviting us, and we thank all of you for being here. Thank you, Arina.
Thank you, Dr. Moyo. So I note we already are having a few questions. Let me, while Dr. Mthembu gets ready, let me try hand over to Francis Kornegay to walk us through our new series, Zoonotica. Francis is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Global Dialogue, and we've been having a bit of some technical difficulties, but maybe we can get it right. Francis, are you ready? Okay, I still can't see Francis talking, so maybe we will need to get a bit creative. Maybe try give him a call.
I see Francis has unmuted himself. His mic is on mute.
So regrettably, we're still having a few technical difficulties, and Francis is going to speak. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, I don't think that's going to work. So I think what we'll do for now is we'll come back at the end of the program and we'll discuss the series then. Dr. Mthembu, I see there's a question already in the Q&A. Would you like to take it now, or would you like to take it during the discussion?
Thanks, Arina. I think you may be referring to the question on Palestine. Is that the one? Yeah. Okay. No. So I just mentioned, sorry, in the chat there that The paper that this discussion, or at least that some of the areas I was alluding to, it does mention quite strongly actually Palestine. And one of the things that we were looking at in the paper. So I mentioned the issue of aligning material resources to the solidarity campaigns that South Africa has. Now, one of the areas we make mention of is a facility such as the African Renaissance Fund within South Africa's Department of International Relations. And we argue that that actually could be one of the important vehicles to use in terms of aligning South Africa's solidarity campaigns and some of South Africa's strategic objectives with its material resources. So we know that for a number of years now, there has been a discussion around forming a South African Development Partnership Agency, which would basically be a successor to the African Renaissance Fund. And that this could actually provide a useful and very practical and tangible resource for South Africa to actually essentially put material resources to the various foreign policy positions that it holds. So whether it's a case of supporting Western Sahara, or whether it's a case of solidarity for Palestine. But it's important then to also have those various tracks of diplomacy to ensure that, yes, you've got your state-to-state relations, but also that you're ensuring that the peoples of those countries also have vehicles in which to actually exercise various forms of solidarity. So it is mentioned in the paper, and we can definitely make that available.
Thank you, Dr. Mthembu. I think let us begin our conversation or our discussions, and in the course of the event, I'll be checking in with Francis to see if we can fix the issues. So let me hand over to Sanusha Naidu, our Senior Research Associate, who will be our moderator for this session, and she will explain the poll we have going on now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arina, and welcome, fellow colleagues, participants, as well as I see a very illustrious group of attendees, including old friends like Professor Shubin and friends from India and across the spectrum. So welcome to our South Africa in the World, our public webinar. Just to give you a little bit of a contextual analysis, this follows on from a closed webinar that we hosted earlier in the month, where we kind of had a few experts around the table and just brainstorming some of the points that Philani raised in his opening address, points that were raised by our FES colleague. And together with that, we want to actually now take this one step further and start asking the questions around this intersection between where we find ourselves in foreign policy. For a while now, I think there's been this kind of interpretation or impression that South African foreign policy has been adrift. Somehow, I think we've been caught in a bit of a tsunami of sorts, if that's the right word to use, in terms of whether or not we can see what's going on in the context of our strategic vision when it comes to foreign policy, what has been the contextual behavior, and is there consistency? And I think Philani kind of summed it up in a very important way, if not in a very critical manner, around some of these tensions between the domestic and the international, the rhetoric and the practice, the ideology and the pragmatism, and more importantly, I think just questions around how much does our capacity, resources, and the role of a professionalized foreign service play in the kind of foreign policy we want to expound or see South Africa take forward. And I think it's a very unique opportunity for us to be able to do this at this point in time, given that we are facing, in the context of the global dynamic, we are facing a lot of unprecedented challenges to the way the global arena has evolved. We talk about the crisis of multilateralism. We talk about the kind of return to protectionism. I've seen people compare this period to the interwar years of 1919, using all kinds of academic and theoretical scholarship, including that of A.H. Carr and the interwar years, and Karl Philani and the Great Transformation. So I think we kind of facing, not just in the context of our domestic political arena, but also in the global and in the continental and in fact the regional, some of the unprecedented ways and the uncertainties. And in one of my famous quotes, and my colleagues will probably get very tired of me because I keep mentioning it all the time, is one by Antonio Gramsci about the old is dying and the new is yet to be born. And in the interim, we have this morbidity of consequences. And I think, to me, why I find this panel and today's seminar so stimulating and important is the fact that we've got young voices on the panel, excluding myself, and we've made it mainly, it's all female, so we're celebrating Women's Month at the same time. And these are individuals and young people, and including their work around some of the key projects that we have on our table of the IGD, including the perception study, on the BRI, including the peace and security and the dynamics of development finance, as well as in the context of some of the more important work we're doing with our diplomatic training, but also with our engagement with Parliament, and how do we actually increase capacity. So what I want to do now is not get too much and become a monologue with myself, but rather to be able to bring in both my colleagues, Arina, who introduced herself as a senior researcher, as well as Faith Mabera, who's also a senior researcher and focuses a lot on the peace and security. And I just want to go back to when I started out in foreign policy, and one of the key lessons I learned was that, if you want to talk about foreign policy, you've got to have this three kind of these three pillars: peace, stability, and development. And I think that has been a very key element, if not central tenet, in the context of South African foreign policy after '94. So I just want to bring in Arina and ask her to just give us a few, about 5 minutes or between 5 and 8 minutes, some of your thoughts about where South African foreign policy is currently in the context of where we find ourselves domestically.
Thanks, Sanusha. So what I'm going to do is pivot this around the discussion we had on the 28th of July last month during the closed webinar. And as Dr. Mthembu mentioned, this project really gravitates around our programmatic areas and activities. And for the longest time, what we've aimed to do is to bring together academics, government, the diplomatic community, business, civil society in a constructive manner. And the idea behind this particular project is to have some kind of horizon scanning exercise, but also to, in many ways, try and contribute to more resilience in actors of foreign policy through content sharing and debate. And just to come to the closed policy dialogue, what we did was to contextualize it according to a few domestic scenarios that we're seeing, or that a number of people are speaking about. And what we did, we shared a document about low, medium, high road scenarios and asked our speakers just to react to them and to really look at the bureaucratic environment or official contributors. And what we started to see quite strongly is that it's really a conversation about pragmatism versus ideology. Now, noting that in order to pursue your pragmatic goals, there is an ideological understanding or even approach to it to begin with. But what came across quite strongly is that certain environments are overly politicized. And there is a need to kind of streamline a number of approaches, specifically with regard to training when it comes to our foreign service. And now this is going to be mitigated in terms of the Foreign Service Act that we saw being enacted in 2019, 2020. And we've already seen a number of more diverse approaches to training, for example, by Dirk already. And something else that came across quite strongly, and this is not unique to DIRCO, is that there is a need to take greater pastoral care of diplomats, in the sense that, especially with your career entry, but also in more senior levels. And I don't mean necessarily to focus overly on content training, but to also think about the other elements, such as your psychological and spiritual needs to an extent, how you interact, in a brand new environment, for example, that sort of thing. Another thing we started to see, another thing that we discussed is how we can take a number of opportunities in understanding the potential of strategic placement of personnel, diplomatic personnel. And we discussed this in the context of the UN Security Council. And we saw that with this term, a number of interesting changes started to take place, where it was possible to see that from May 2019, for example, the experienced diplomats who had engaged, in other counterparts and other missions, as well as HQ. So just to backtrack a little bit, by placing more experienced diplomats specifically in that role, you're starting to see a better communication, more streamlined approaches on positions especially. And another thing that started to emerge, specifically a big thing, was that there is a lack of coordination between foreign policy and home affairs policy, the immigration policy specifically. So these are a number of gaps that can be addressed in a systematic way as well. Then another point we discussed was the role of the APRM, specifically how we are managing it, and what kind of leadership sets a precedent for other countries, and overall the success of the APRM, which of course is a litmus test of what is happening in the country and what kind of challenges are expected for the next 10 years especially. And then another point that came across strongly was the role of oversight with actors. And when we talk about actors, I mean, we have our official stream and our unofficial stream. Our official stream related to your government departments and parliament, where your executive is monitoring and evaluating foreign policy from various sources and source documents, to the unofficial stream, which is your academia, your civil society, your business. And there is scope for a more effective use of parliament working together with unofficial streams. In addition to that, another perception that we discussed was the potential that DIRCO is more of a gatekeeper at the moment rather than a conduit in terms of its potential. But then again, it's really unclear to what extent this is bureaucratized or politicized, because we are, again, from an outside looking in perspective. And then another thing we spoke about quite a bit was this role of pragmatism, especially in terms of how economic diplomacy is being pursued, which means there needs to be greater integration with the private sector and business. And while we're seeing more and more that sectors are starting to make decisions only once they are pushed into a corner, which doesn't bode well for the kind of resilience you're hoping to build in developing, your organized structures. But let me leave it there, and then I'll be able to engage further as we go along. Thanks, Sanusha.
Thank you so much, Arina. I think what you've done is you've captured really in a salient way what had been the core themes that came out of our closed dialogue, particularly around capacity, linkages between missions and headquarters back home. More importantly, I think questions around how do we actually use our institutions at the domestic level to also advance our kind of pragmatic ideology going forward and so forth. But I think what's also important for us to bear in mind with regard to this whole foreign policy ambit we find ourselves in is also understanding to what extent South Africa's role serving on the UN Security Council currently, but also serving on the as the chair of the AU is really about the kind of pragmatism you want to bring to your foreign policy arena and the engagements you want to cultivate and craft? And is it just not about wanting to be on those kinds of international spaces and fora, but it's about having more substance to it? And I think we've got a few Q&A questions coming through, which talks back to some of these questions that you've been raising around capacity, alignment, coordination, and so forth. And I wanted to ask Faith if she doesn't want to maybe just jump in here at this point with regard to the questions around the principles of our foreign policy, the question of where we are in terms of the kind of strategic vision that we have, but also I think bringing it more from how South Africa is perceived, not necessarily only within the context of our domestic landscape, but having a network outside, Faith. How is South Africa perceived from the outside based on the kind of idea that we have a moral authority, or we have a high ground that we normally occupy in terms of our positioning on important global governance issues like the ICC, etc. And there have been questions also being raised about where do we find ourselves in terms of understanding these points that have been raised in the context of a kind of transitional justice, the kind of social justice struggles that are happening around the continent, but also in the broader context of where the multilateral system currently finds itself in a very invidious and caught in almost a deadlock.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Sanusha. So I think Arina has laid out the key elements pretty concisely. And as she was speaking, what struck me is the question about whether, in framing this debate and the theme of this talk, whether South Africa's foreign policy is being caught between pragmatism and ideology, or if you like, you can actually say, is it being caught on one hand in almost the non-imperialist and solidarity with the global South, that impetus on one hand, and on the other, the very lofty ambition of being a human rights champion, and here very much in tune with its neoliberal outlook and its pursuit of the African agenda as a key priority of its foreign policy. In addressing some of the questions that I'm seeing already coming in about what informs South African foreign policy, and this is linked to the poll question about one option that participants are asked to actually contend with is the question of whether there is coherence in terms of balancing both ideology and injecting pragmatism at some point in view of the reality of the international arena, or the question of where it has become rigid and dogmatic in sticking to its guns, as quote unquote, as far as ideology is concerned. I think that's the key question that we are asking, and this can be seen when we try and get into a very deeper analysis on its performance, its statements, rhetoric, also the kind of bargaining and the kind of what we call communicative action that South Africa has been trying to pursue at various multilateral fronts, not limited to the UN, but also at the AU and close home in its SADC backyard. Those are some of the things that we need to investigate if you're trying to look at the issue of coherence and correspondence as far as foreign policy is concerned. You mentioned here that perhaps in highlighting the priorities, so we know the priorities, the African agenda tops it. The question of balancing and acting as a bridge builder between the North and the South is another key priority. And here I'm drawing heavily on the draft paper, the Ubuntu policy of South Africa's foreign policy. And then we have African agenda, bridge building role, and this is in tune with South Africa's profiling as a middle power in international relations. The other one is what Philani also mentioned in his opening remarks about solidarity and championing the cause of the global South. And then the other one that's important also is that South Africa is the DNA essentially also of South Africa's foreign policy drive is multilateralism. That's also at the essence of what informs a lot of the actions, the priorities that South Africa is seeking to engage in. So that's a very quick overview, and I don't want to simplify it other than that. And then we can pack a lot of the other issues around those four priorities, which obviously there's fluidity across those pillars. But in having said that, let me then turn to the one that I think is important also in terms of looking at proximity. The fact South Africa's Africanness, you can call it that, it's not only its geographic positioning in Africa, but also the fact that it has reoriented and driven and injected a very Afrocentric perspective into its foreign policy priorities. Having said that, I think it's important, let me provide a very quick overview of some, and this you can catch also on the IGD. We are also trying to do regularly what mapping of trends. So important trends that are important for policymakers and decision makers on the African continent. And I'm going to touch a bit on what has been observed in terms of quarter 1 and quarter 2 of 2020, and some of the others that are extending into the last 2 quarters of this year. And also we are also trying to assess whether these are what we call mega trends or long-term trends. So I'll start with a very quick overview of just across the continent: West Africa, North Africa, East Africa and the Horn, and closer home here in Southern Africa. If we look, I think, at the trans-regional dynamics of the Sahel and the Maghreb and the Horn of Africa, I think the Sahelian context is important. We can't ignore the fact of the developments that are happening there. And I saw a very interesting article the other day that termed what is the overly securitized approach of external actors working on not only counter-terrorism in the Sahel, but also the question of SSR, security sector reform in the Sahel. It's been interestingly labeled as a traffic jam or a security jam in the Sahel. I found those remarks very interesting, especially because there's been an increase in security and in the provision of security, external security provided in security programs. And in one hand, it's almost becoming apparent that something is not working, and that's the missing link. Perhaps the missing link is that the lopsided focus on securitization is working at the expense of a focus on the human security question, on the questions of addressing the structural drivers of violence and the drivers that actually lead to radicalization. So that's one element. The other one that I think that when you're looking at Sahel is this very real possibility and very real risk of contagion. There's already been almost a tripling of violent events if you follow the statistics in the Sahel. And experts are saying that there's a risk of contagion with the jihadist violence actually gaining ground in coastal West Africa, your Burkina Faso, your Ghana's, and also using Burkina Faso as a launching pad into coastal West Africa. So that's something that is of growing concern. The question of, one cannot discuss the question of Sahel without delving into the more controversial issues about France's role and the specter of France-Afrique in Africa. And what I find when you look at the take and a lot of the analysis, particularly in international media around France's role in the Sahel, which has been termed its forever war, if you look at the situation in Mali, is this idea of there's a narrative emerging that pits almost what we call French prowess on one hand versus African dysfunction on the other. And then all the politics revolves around this core narrative. So it's interesting to also unpack some of the issues around that very dominant narrative. Now, moving into the other parts of Africa, and here I'm going to focus on the transitions. So the high-wide transition in Sudan, the highlight of which was the ouster strongman al-Bashir last year, and this very optimistic and very positive development of the transitional government. But that's also been, it's almost been beleaguered with a lot of domestic challenges, notwithstanding the fractures within the security apparatus. the power struggle that's there, that's also feeding into, and it's interesting in observing the popular revolutionary dynamics in South Sudan, the role that the protests, even in reanimating a mini protest late in June, that was actually dedicated to the purpose of ensuring that the transitional government stays the course and challenging some of the military appointments in Sudan. Obviously, the big ticket item is the removal of South Africa from the US state sponsors of terrorism list. So that's a big one, and in addition to the economic renewal, obviously. Turning to Ethiopia, which has seen the latest upheaval, and a trigger moment was the killing of the famous popular Oromo singer Huchalu Hadessa, and this triggered a spate of protests. But this is only, you can't only look at that as a one issue. You have to look at it as linked to the context of the broader question of Ethiopia's ethno-federalist model, the kind of politics of co-optation that it promotes, the kind of very vernacularized, and the idea of challenging Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, the fact that we cannot just label the Oromo, obviously the majority Oromo, as a monolithic group. There's a lot of internal and state-sanctioned violence dynamics that are feeding into long-held grievances in Ethiopia, and that also is detrimental to a lot of the progress done around political reform. Also in the Horn, the big issue is the Nile dispute over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. People talk only of Egypt and Ethiopia and forget to mention that Sudan is also part of the trilateral dialogue. And I'm not going to get too much into details in the interest of time, but I think two quick issues are worth mentioning. Number one, at stake is the question of the filling of the dam. So the filling of the dam, and particularly in conditions of drought. So they are yet to agree on the drought mitigation measures. The other contentious issue is the question of dispute resolution and what kind of arbitration all parties would be amenable to. That's the other issue that I think is generating a lot of contention among the trilateral talks. And turning to Somaliland, which caused a bit of a diplomatic ruffle, if you want to call it ruffle, a lot of feathers with Somaliland getting into an agreement with Taiwan. This holds important questions for us. We already saw President Xi Jinping of the People's Republic of China sending in another Wong Pen as his African lead point and trying to douse out some of these little fires, quote unquote, if I can call them that are coming out on the continent, notwithstanding the other incident that we saw happening about 3 months ago with the African citizens in Guangzhou, and the kind of negative and flack that the Chinese also received with regard to that. And southern Somalia is also another hotspot with broader regional dynamics. If you look at the emergence of violence in Jubaland and Mogadishu forces, those federal forces engaging in a standoff. And quickly, the northern tier of the continent, I think, is important. Philani already mentioned the internationalization of the Libyan conflict, the kind of proxy warfare dynamics. Although I have a bit of contention with the usage of the word proxy because of the implications in humanitarian war, but I think for the purposes of this session, let us use the term proxy warfare that has been going on in Libya and the kind of implications it has for the regional security in the Maghreb, and also leading into the trans-regional dynamic, the Sahel as well, and the Horn of Africa. Algeria also, which was in the throes of having followed elections in 2019, we see a president there who has very little legitimacy. And in light of the popular and the kind of praise that initially the Iraq movement in Algeria generated, there was the question about whether on one hand, will the Iraq protest movement come out and be a political force on the Algerian space, or will it be caught up and be undermined by the political maneuvering that the government is enacting in actually silencing the protests? That's the key question. So Algeria at a crossroads. Morocco, Philani also mentioned the kind of redirection we've seen under King Mohammed VI, injecting a bit of more foreign African-centered foreign policy outlook. In fact, in 2018, 85% of Moroccan FDI was targeted at sub-Saharan Africa. So that tells you what impetus is informing Morocco, diversifying obviously its alliance bases. We've seen also how it negotiated some of the aspects and renegotiated, some of the aspects in its FTA with the US. That's important for that region. And in ending, I think, Sanusha, there are two issues that, and this is something that I've also had a conversation with colleagues, including yourself. I think circling back to South Africa, another important development, and here I'm keen to hear what some of the thoughts emerging are around South Africa's foreign policy. Number one is the race for the WTO director, which has been depicted as a three-way race when you're talking about it in terms of the three African candidates, the Kenyan candidate, the Nigerian candidate, and the Egyptian candidate. And the critique that I've seen emerging is that it shows to an extent African disunity, and maybe this will work to the disadvantage of a very strong point for opportunity for an African to head up the WTO. The second one is recent developments about South Africa's corporations, multinational corporations pulling out of Nigeria, citing tough operating environment. Here I'm talking about Shoprite, PEP, Truworths, and a host of other South African enterprises that had moved some of their operations in Nigeria, but have been forced to pack up and have a very deep introspection. So I'll leave it at that, Sanusha. I've tried to cover a lot of the African currents, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you a lot, Fred. I think you brought in some important trends, new impulses in the continent that will have very important impact for South African foreign policy. And just on that point, a very interesting question being raised by Brooke Spector, and I think others as well, with regard to where does South Africa find itself? I mean, the case in point being Zimbabwe, Sudan, but also I think bringing Mozambique now. And Faith, you as well as Philani can respond to this question, because we hosted a closed dialogue on Mozambique, and we were looking at what is South Africa's role. And South Africa is the chair of the AU, and hasn't really been giving the kind of direction it should be giving, or are we seeing that the kind of human rights approach that has always been the so-called anchor, not necessarily the anchor in the sense where it had to be the overriding anchor of foreign policy, but the impression was that this is where our foreign policy context lies. Or are we now moving it, as Brooke Spector asked, to other values? So is it fair to think that South Africa can do everything on its own, because it has, as another of our attendees has raised, the question of having the moral high ground? And of course now it seems that the moral high ground is not necessarily in the kind of coherence and cohesive nature that it should be. Or is this just an unfair question to ask? And should there be other countries in the continent, a kind of a compact of different countries coming together, working together around those 3 points you raised earlier, Philani, around engagement, partnership, and looking at collaboration and cooperation with countries in Africa that can deal with some of these regional spillovers, which are critical for the stability, peace, development, and of course, the way South Africa positions its foreign policy. So I'll start with you, Philani.
Thanks, Sanusha. I don't know if I can cover all of that, but I'll chew some of it. I'll start with the question you raised. I think it was Brooke Spector that raised it on South Africa's, let's say South Africa's orientation in terms of human rights, that it's been criticized, that there's been a divergence between its values and its practice. And that I think someone else also in the chat also asked something similar. They said that for their question was, around the moral high ground that South Africa used to occupy, which was largely informed by the ANC's international policy. And they are arguing that South Africa has lost some of that. So I think those questions are somewhat interrelated. I do think that there's a close, very close and obvious correlation between the internal cohesion within South Africa and the external cohesion of our foreign policy. So at times when internally, when the economy has been relatively on the right track, I think you've had a much more coherent foreign policy. I mean, you hark back to your type of your African Renaissance agenda. But at the same time, in years where we've seen challenges within the country, I think our foreign policy has also been called to question, and rightly so, because I think what people have been saying is how can you discuss, things like good governance and so forth when you yourself are struggling with those issues. But I don't think, that should prevent the country from continuing to advocate for some of those values, because even when we found ourselves, domestically under a cloud or under fierce debate around issues of corruption and so forth, but the debate is happening in an open environment. The debate is happening where the media is not prohibited from doing its job. There's a lot of good investigative journalism that is taking place. Civil society groups, are quite active. So I think it's important to understand that we are dealing with those issues within an environment that is open and where ideas can be contested openly. So that is a positive. But I do think that in a case like Zimbabwe, where South Africa, may have maybe dropped the ball, is in terms of the enforcement of what was then, the government of national unity, the process which drafted a new constitution in Zimbabwe. I think that is where there should and could have been more teeth to the actual agreements that were signed, so that if any of the sides, whether it's in opposition or a governing party, when any of the sides move away from the agreed principles, that there is an enforcement mechanism, that there is pressure from the various stakeholders to ensure that you don't move away from what has actually been agreed to. And at the same time, I think speaking with various stakeholders within Zimbabwe, in the various political parties, they themselves also say that they missed an opportunity when all sides were speaking within the government of national unity, or all sides were speaking. They were meeting at cabinet meetings and various other fora. So that was a missed opportunity to actually ensure that there are far-reaching reforms that actually take place in Zimbabwe, but at the same time that they are enforced. And I think in today's mediation efforts, those are some of the things that South Africa will have to reflect on. But I also think there's also a potential, in a sense, that I don't think South Africa is still utilizing all of its diplomatic tools available. For instance, I think Parliament could play a much stronger role in terms of weighing in on certain foreign policy matters, especially where there is a feeling that those issues move against the values that South Africa, or the values that are enshrined within South Africa's own constitution. Because ultimately, when thinking about South African foreign policy, is that we have to understand that the values of that foreign policy will always be informed by the South African constitution. And those values should then be reflected also in some of our external engagement. And I think Parliament has a stronger role to play when it actually comes to that. It also, I mean, also with regards Mozambique, I think one of the things that, you know, someone already asked the question that South Africa seems to be silent, that South Africa and SADC seem to be silent. And I think this also goes back to also how we understand the manner in which South Africa is engaging diplomatically. Whilst in the background, South Africa would have been engaging with its counterparts in Mozambique for quite some time, South Africa would not explicitly, you know, go out unless it was actually requested by the Mozambican government. And that brings about, I think, certain dilemmas in terms of its strategy, because we've seen that there are also private actors now, private security actors in Mozambique. But also what we've seen is that despite the region acknowledging the challenges happening in Mozambique, we still haven't seen a concrete regional approach towards it. We're still seeing bilateral approaches within the SADC. And I think that hampers the response. So the response, yes, in that sense, seems slow, because if South Africa is more focused on trying to get a regional approach and trying to get buy-in from the whole region before actually pronouncing, then that can definitely be seen as slowing down, you know, the response in trying to get consensus from the region. Now, consensus has always been, in terms of South Africa's multilateral approach, especially within the African continent, is something that has been there. And I think we must go back to around 1995 to understand what happened when South Africa, you know, moved away from that. When South Africa strongly condemned the killing of Ken Saro-Wiwa in Nigeria. And Mandela had actually called for a boycott of the Nigerian government. What South Africa found there is that, you know, instead of other countries joining it, it became relatively isolated on the African continent. And other countries looked at it with a bit of suspicion in terms of, are you trying to be the big brother on the continent? And I think this dynamic, South Africa has not fully, let's say, recovered from that idea. But I think what you saw in South Africa's approach after that incident is it tried to work much more behind the scenes and try to gain consensus. And I think, you know, the jury is out there whether that has really been an effective approach and whether that needs to change moving forward.
Thank you so much, Philani. I think you've touched on very key points, and I want to come back to this because I think there's a very interesting subtext to this discussion, and that is, does South Africa still have traction within the context of what it wants to achieve? And I know we spoke about Zimbabwe and we spoke about Mozambique, but just given the recent developments around the appointed envoys to Zimbabwe by President Ramaphosa and all that surrounded that debacle, and you know, it goes back to an earlier point that you raised around the progressive internationalism in the paper that you and Francis co-authored. And I'm wondering whether that progressive internationalism and the way the world is seen needs to be also reimagined for the party and for the South African government, because of course, you know, we'll come back to that linkage between the resolutions in terms of the resolutions taken at the party congress and how much of that needs to be kind of rethought in the context of a changing landscape. But I want to get to Faith, because Faith, you've been following the Mozambique situation in the northern part of the country. We've hosted this dialogue last week with key actors and followers of that of the situation there. And I just want to ask you your impression of where South Africa is, in the context of, is it looking consistently around taking a more SADC aligned approach, or is there something more that it can do in the context of whether or not this represents a direct threat, as in the case of Zimbabwe, or is it further away, and therefore we little bit thinking about Mozambique not in the context of how we think about Zimbabwe?
Okay, thanks, Sanusha. Regarding the Mozambique growing extremism in northern Mozambique, I think we must first of all start with a very clear indication that Mozambique is a sovereign state. So, in as much as a lot of the headlines has been, oh, South Africa should do something and South Africa should move in, we shouldn't discount or ignore the notion that it is a sovereign state. And having said that, also the idea of SADC, what has been termed as SADC tardiness in coming to the party, or they're dragging their feet, they're failing to come into consensus, into some kind of consensual position on what to do in terms of a regional intervention. Remember that for a complex and asymmetric and rapidly evolving threat that, like what you're seeing in terms of the insurgency in Cabo Delgado, is a lot of experts, a lot of the people who advise the organ also on politics, security, and defense will certainly tell them that yes, there is a threat emerging, but you cannot afford to walk in blindly without the essentials being important for strategy. The question of, do you have good intelligence on the ground? Do you understand the tactics that the insurgents are employing? Do you understand where the supply lines are? Do you understand the kind of modus operandi that they're enacting and the kind of implications it has? But on the other hand, the preference for the Mozambican government in reaching out to, for instance, Tanzania, Angola, in terms of bilateral security arrangements, but it's also forward. Mozambique has also alerted the SADC organ in terms of the security issue and looking for a regional solution to the problem. But on one hand, there's the issue of capacity. In light of a yet to be operational SADC standby force, the question also of military doctrine. How will such a regional intervention work alongside the very complex issue of private military contractors who are already on the ground in Mozambique? That's the one question that we also need to navigate, certainly a very complicated one. The question of capacity. COVID-19 is here. It's caused a huge dent in a lot of national and also the regional finance into addressing the spillover, economic and social spillover from the pandemic, and also the huge humanitarian crisis that we are having in Mozambique, in northern Mozambique, because of the insurgency. All these are elements that you need to factor into a comprehensive approach. And I think in as much as all eyes are looking to South Africa as de facto hegemon in Southern Africa in terms of you go in, remember South Africa is also humiliation in the Central African Republic. When it sent in a contingent of 24 special forces to try and secure the city from the Seleka rebels who are coming in. And what happened in the end, there had to be almost a negotiation to allow, on top of 5 soldiers getting killed, there had to be an agreement to actually retract and ship off the soldiers who are caught sitting ducks in Central African Republic. Surely that's a tactical mistake that South Africa would not want to repeat in the case of Mozambique. So unilateral questions are certainly very difficult to navigate. Unilateral action would also run counter to the very regional focused approach that has been a key pillar of South Africa's SADC involvement. And also the question about what Philani raised about, does South Africa want to come across as a hegemon, or is it playing coy and preferring to almost play a very benign role and not turn into a very parochial actor in SADC, and hence the question of, when you look at the circumstances in Zimbabwe, the circumstances in Mozambique, should it be time for South Africa to actually say, okay, we are comfortable with playing the role of a benign hegemon? That's the question that is put to us at this moment. But certainly the Mozambique issue is one that has, and it's interesting also, you raised the question about Zimbabwe also, Sanusha. Remember that even as South Africa sent in its envoys to go meet with President Mnangagwa, President Mnangagwa was actually the chair of the organ on the peace and security in SADC. So I think it's almost like it answers your question of why wouldn't something happen in terms of a very strong regional condemnation of what happened of Zimbabwe. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Faith. I want to bring in Arina on a few of these issues, because I think you've been monitoring a lot of this from the context of looking at the diplomatic training, but also involved with your own research on some of these topics with regard to South Africa's foreign policy, ideological space, and impact.
Thanks, Sanusha. So just to backtrack a bit for the sake of my own, explanation, and also to touch on one of the questions, or two of the questions even. As we've spoken, a big driver of the ANC foreign policy is history, shrouded in the anti-apartheid struggle, which is also informed by a strong solidarity agenda with key items. And moving forward, I mean, there was a question of what is South Africa's long-term view in terms of foreign policy, especially given how much the world has changed since the financial fallout as well. And moving forward, we're seeing that the strategic partnerships are there. But is it a case of being overwhelmed and not moving resources effectively? Are there not enough fingers, and are there too many pies? So in that, I mean, in addition to the current modes of engagement, the long-term tool of choice is economic diplomacy. But even there, we're seeing that disconnect again in terms of how you're implementing it, how you're achieving this, in that linkage to the private sector and business, to relate more to what is happening, with South Africa's foreign policy. I've been looking a lot at the way South Africa is perceived in the continent specifically, and the field or abroad. And what is interesting is, yes, there is that kind of broader argument. Is it a big brother? Is it a bully? South Africa needs to start thinking in a different kind of dynamic ways to start to achieve these kind of pragmatic agenda points that it has set for itself, in some ways being unapologetic, and some ways being apologetic. And another point is looking at specifically South Africa's perception and how South Africa chooses to brand itself, or what it chooses to communicate about itself. And I refer specifically to branding because the norm all of a sudden has been to kind of relate to this idea of nation branding, where you are communicating a kind of ethos, a kind of understanding about what your country is, what it represents, and what it wants to achieve. And there are a number of things that resonate, from South Africa's foreign policy white paper, even the Foreign Service Act, where you can see that forms part of the South African brand. I mean, we can list a number of elements, for example, the foreign policy of Ubuntu, the image of Nelson Mandela. You can even relate it to international sporting events, etc. But we keep coming back to this kind of coherence and this kind of consistency, where South Africa is not always communicating what it wants to communicate through its actions. And this is where it's being called out and on being inconsistent, specifically in Africa. And while abroad it may be perceived as this bridge builder that can actively have these conversations that other countries necessarily cannot be able to have. At home, when I say at home in the continent, is not able to achieve what it wants to achieve in so many words, to put it bluntly. And that is where the poll comes in. Let me just remind you, please, can you just answer the poll, and so we can get a few more perceptions in on that, because that also speaks to this idea of where South Africa wants to go. I mean, it's already set its lofty goals in terms of what it wants to achieve. But again, we keep coming back to this issue of consistency, specifically in the continent, as Faith and Philani have been discussing. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Arina. I think you've raised some other points for me, which then I become very facetious and ask, is South Africa moving with the world, or is the world moving beyond South Africa in the context? But I want to raise two questions, which I think are really important, that have come from Peter Vale, who is one of our esteemed foreign policy experts in the country. And he raises a fascinating a point, which I think we've got to ask ourselves in playing scenario building and so forth, is to what extent have we actually, if from a conceptual perspective, if tomorrow we see the ANC lose power, what would be the effect on foreign policy? Now I'm opening this up to Arina, to Faith, to even Philani, and if there are people in the attendee list who want to raise their hand and respond to this, including our FES colleague, what would be the impact on South African foreign policy if, in the context of what's happening domestically, and I think we can't ignore the way the domestic impacts on the international, what would be the impact on South African foreign policy from a conceptual level, and where we're going forward? And just linked to that is the other question around the idea that, are we looking in the context of South African foreign policy with regard to our architecture, our diplomatic architecture? Again, another question raised by Brooke Spector around, are we seeing this kind of divergence between, or the mismatch of skills between what's happening with regard to the kind of what we currently have in Parliament passed as a legislation, which is the professionalization of the Foreign Service, which is quite an important piece of legislation. And how is that then translated into practice in terms of whether we have the kind of career diplomat, people that have been trained in the context of wanting to become diplomats and occupying the space and carrying out the capacity that we need in foreign policy, or are we seeing, as Brooks puts it very eloquently, the freelancing of non-diplomatic actors dipping their toe or whole foot in the diplomatic waters? And I open this up both to Arina, to Faith, as well as to Philani, and to anyone else who wants to jump in here and raise how they see this. And then after this, I want to move more towards our multilateral engagements around BRICS in the Global South, in the context of IORA and so forth. So I don't know, can I start with Faith on this and then move from there?
Okay, Sanusha, I think let me in thinking, I also find it particularly, it's a very interesting question that Dr. Will raises about essentially reimagining South Africa's foreign policy apart from the ANC. It's very interesting because even the very nature of, if you like, post-apartheid South African foreign policy is so embedded within the state party relations that one can even effectively argue that it's impossible to see it apart from the ANC at this juncture in time. So if you want to engage in crystal gazing, horizon scanning, scenario building, whatever you want to call it, I would point to two directions. So here, allow me to go further abroad and look at another, arguably, you can say, established quote unquote democracy, the US. So in light of the changing administrations that we've had, what has sort of stuck with the US ideology, and what's bringing a lot of contention now is the idea that it's shifting in terms of the various levels of analysis of foreign policy. If you're looking at it from individual or domestic or regional, that's becoming the variable. Now, circling back to the South African case, I argue that what we have is a foreign policy of ambiguity. It's a foreign policy that is inherently anti-pragmatic. And by its very definition, being anti-pragmatic is being dogmatic and it's being rigid. And you cannot say you have a pragmatic foreign policy if, when presented with very stark reality, you want to sort of fall back on your safe options. That's rigid, and that's definitely what's that's going to get you in the international arena. It's going to get you losing your political capital and your moral capital, which is what we are sitting with at the moment. But even then, ultimately, from a constructivist perspective, the bigger challenge for South Africa is because it has failed to adequately define what its national interests are. And as long as national interests remain elusive, we will continue to have a foreign policy of ambiguity. And that's my projection. So even if the ANC as has been hypothetically put forward loses power, we will, unless there's a clear articulation of national interest, unless there's a very real admission on being pragmatic, we'll still continue to have the ambiguity and incoherence regardless.
Thanks, Faith. Arina?
Thanks, Sanusha. Thanks, Faith. So I absolutely love this idea of playing with what ifs, and this is something we started to do in our training with DIRCO, or rather our workshops or seminars with DIRCO. And we started playing with a number of what ifs. We didn't touch on this specific what if, but maybe that's something we need to pose, you know, a question we need to ask. And for me, this actually relates directly to what Sanusha was asking. Does South Africa still have traction without a clear articulation of interest, of South African interests? And were we to have this kind of change, can soft power alone, how far can South Africa ride on this kind of soft power or these kind of perceptions, or on autopilot, so to speak, while we get our ducks in a row? We don't exactly know what the electoral landscape is going to look like in 10 years at this specific point. And this is another question I want to ask. In this kind of scenario, are we actually playing with the same kind of with the same kind of electoral landscape? Will there be a change to the electoral system or the use of political parties? And I mean, if we're specifically referring to the current political parties that we have and looking at their foreign policy agenda or their election manifestos before elections come along, and also when you look at the engagement in the parliamentary committees, the questions and debate that arise are kind of telling. And in this case, I'm going to refer mostly to DA and EFF. And I mean, I recently read a DA document where they say it's about balancing national interest with a rights-based agenda. Fine, pointing out, and oftentimes they are pointing out inconsistencies with human rights approaches of the ANC-led government, but also then they are making choices that seem contradictory to national interests themselves, like engaging with Taiwan. Now, we all know about the One China policy and South Africa's agreement to that. But in comparison to Taiwan and South Africa's, let's say, the economic diplomacy agenda, the actors have a significant weighting in this. And this also interlinks, you know, with the manifesto with foreign investment that they have and the domestic policy constraints. So they talk about a number of things, and they emphasize trade quite a bit. Whereas the EFF, you know, they specifically call for, you know, the cancellation of apartheid debt, radical transformation of multilateral blocs, and they're much more overt in the kind of ideology that they want to pursue. And they're very critical of the kind of engagements that South Africa currently has. And while they are much more specific in what they want to see from South Africa's future positioning in Africa, IORA, for example, some of the calls in the election manifesto are inconsistent. I mean, something that stood out quite starkly from the 2019 election manifesto was, for example, and I quote, working towards African isolation of Botswana on the basis of this US military base, but it does not call for this kind of isolation of other African countries. That was quite interesting for me. Now, both these parties are currently very critical of the kinds of engagements that the ANC has and pursues, for example. But I think if one of these parties was to change and gain more control tomorrow in this hypothetical what if we are playing with, they would also pursue, you know, the criticized cadre deployment on their own side or their own version of that, because again, national objectives are linked to a kind of ideological perspective and how you want to pursue that. And similarly, I mean, would a pragmatic foreign policy then still be pursued? You're starting to see that ideology still plays quite a big role in how pragmatism, you know, is approached. So that was this kind of thinking in what if, you know, with the current players on the board is quite interesting. We're not actually making space for what if new players emerge, what would they look like? And I think I'd actually like to hear a bit more from Prof. Vale, what he thinks. But yeah, I thought that was actually quite an interesting question. Thanks.
Thanks, Arina, for bringing in some of those dynamics. Before I get to you, Philani, let me just ask you as a kind of add-on to the two questions that I raised. Given the current work that we're doing on the ANC issues around the resolutions, and in the context of foreign policy, just as a matter of interest, do you think every resolution that is passed, and you mentioned Israel before in your opening remarks, that they need to be enacted, they need to become a kind of legislative policy? And you know, Israel is one example, but the other example is we're coming back to the ICC now. We're coming back to that debate about the ICC. And just in the context of what Prof. Vale is asking, and even in the context of the architecture that Brooke Spector is asking, in that way, does this mean that South Africa's foreign policy is kind of playing catch up, or it's trying to appease a particular constituency that exists around the way they see the world, but the world has moved fundamentally into a different space, and that progressive internationalism is a progressive internationalism that's not taking into account the changing structural landscape that we have currently?
No, I liked the question also. And also thanks, Sanusha, for that, because I actually think, yes, in order to answer that question, we need to actually go back. We need to backtrack a little bit. And I mean, in the 2017 discussion document of the ANC's international relations, the ANC notes that progressive internationalism envisages a just, equitable, non-racial, non-patriarchal, diverse, democratic, and equal world system. It requires the building of alliances and solidarity with progressive forces in the South and North, fighting for similar objectives in world affairs. It also requires a bold and militant advocacy of fundamental transformation of the global balance of forces, a radical restructuring of global governance, and a progressive global movement in which the ANC's posture is that of a revolutionary liberation movement committed to finish the work entrusted to it by history since 1912. Now, I think it's important to just note that. So this idea of progressive internationalism, which is something that I guess one of the reasons why the ANC has played such a role in shaping foreign policy thinking in South Africa is also because of the importance that the international pillar of the struggle against apartheid, what an important role it played. I mean, we must just remember that after 1960, when the ANC and the other liberation movements were banned in South Africa and its structures were being dismantled, essentially the task entrusted to OR Tambo was to build the ANC's presence in exile and to let it be operational and engage with the world in showcasing what is happening in South Africa. Now, at that time, I mean, you think that the ANC had very significant and strong thinkers on international relations, such as your Josiah Jele, such as your Johnny Makatini, Thabo Mbeki, who headed their Department of International Affairs at the time. But also quite a number of very skilled diplomats. I mean, you must remember that at the time, by 1980, the ANC had even a larger presence in the world than the apartheid government. So it comes from a very strong international relations tradition. So issues of solidarity were always center. Issues of multilateralism were always center. It was always opposed to a unilateral approach to world affairs. So I think when looking historically, there has been a consistent stream of thinking around international relations within the ANC. And that's natural that that would have then shaped also thinking within the broader country and the broader discourse on South Africa's role in the world. But I think what has not happened is that we have not had a process that is multi-party, but that also involves other stakeholders that are involved in foreign policy to actually craft something that other colleagues have now alluded to, something akin to a national interest understanding or a national interest framework or a national interest document. And I think that process would, the ANC is the governing party, so the ANC would be leading such processes, but the ANC would have to work with other political parties, but also work with other non-state actors also to have an understanding of South Africa's role in the world and to have an understanding of South Africa's national interests. And this has become especially important in an environment where political competition is increasing domestically, where different
laptop.
Francis, you unmuted. Okay. Where in an environment where you have stronger political competition at home. So you have an environment where, yes, the ANC is in government at the national level, but as I said earlier, cities and provinces are playing an important role in international relations. Now, if we do not have a common understanding of South Africa's national interests, national priorities in the world, then we will come to more incidences where provinces and cities are engaged in activities that may not be benefiting, to South Africa's broader national interests. So there has to be a process, I think, that does cut across party lines. And I do think committees that are important there are, for instance, such as your Parliamentary Committee on International Relations, which have multiple, parties interacting over there. And I think such discussions will need to take place at a greater pace, moving forward. And then I just also think in terms of also what maybe just to highlight that the previous South Africa in the world we had the report had a nice subsection there, which actually looked at the different foreign policy positions of the various political parties within South Africa. And I found that quite interesting, whether it was matters aligned to, whether it was matters around Israel, Palestine, and a whole range of other issues. But, you know, one got an understanding of what the different political parties think of foreign policy. And I think this is something that we also need to pay a much closer attention to, especially with growing competition at home. And then just lastly, Sanusha, I think that some of the resolutions of the ANC should not necessarily be for the state, you know, to implement. Some are for obvious reasons, are for the state to implement. But I think some of them have to be and are for the ANC and its alliance partners to implement. So the ANC itself as an organization has to have a visible and consistent international relations program that is not necessarily attached to the state. And the reason is because the ANC as a political party also engages with other political parties, whether it's in the Progressive International, whether it's your Sao Paulo Forum. So as a political party, they can shape foreign policy through directly engaging with other political parties and social movements. And you know, so that you do have, you know, an understanding that these are state-led processes, but that these are purely state processes that are led and conducted by, you know, the political party, which is a non-state actor.
I completely agree with you, Philani, on that dynamic and how do you define that dynamic between party and state. But I also want to welcome Catherine Grant, who's joined us and making time to be with us today in her busy schedule. And I think, Catherine, so far we've been talking a lot about the contextual architecture of South African foreign policy. Peter Vale and Brooke Specs have been raising valuable points around the relationship between the human rights and other values, questions of, you know, if there was some kind of political dynamic that unfolds unexpectedly in South Africa, what would be the impact on foreign policy? Hence, you know, if the ANC loses power, and the construct around what Peter Vale has now raised as the idea of national interest being an ideological construct and an analytical one. But I want to park those issues for a bit, because I think we also touched on economic diplomacy with Arina, and I would like to actually ask Catherine to give us a bit of a perspective, because yes, we have been hearing this idea or this notion that economic diplomacy informs our foreign policy as well as a kind of value construct and a kind of strategic vision, and we see it a lot. Do we really understand it? Does government understand, or in the foreign policy context, what does it mean? And linked to that, I want it would be nice if, Catherine, you could also shed some light on the role of the private sector. We're speaking a lot about the public, we're speaking about stakeholders, we're speaking about a professionalized foreign service, but the private sector is key as well, particularly if we take the argument that the trajectory of foreign policy is also about how it links to foreign economic relations. And then finally, a point around South African corporates in Africa, just what's going on. You know, ShopRite is leaving Nigeria. There's a potential they may be closing down in Angola. You know, where South African corporates were in the heydays, not to use a pun of ShopRite, but where they were after 94 and where they are now, and has the continent moved ahead with more competitors, and is South African corporates beginning to find that space a congested one. So Catherine, welcome, and it's over to you.
Thanks, Sanusha, and apologies that I wasn't able to be here from the beginning. It sounds like you've been having a very interesting discussion this morning, so I'm pleased to be able to join you now. Is my connection functioning okay? Can you hear me? Because I see my screen is frozen.
We can see you, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I'm sitting outside getting some sun here. So you've raised a lot of issues there. I think where I'd start is perhaps with the construct of economic diplomacy itself, and how the private sector relates to that. Because I think that traditionally economic diplomacy for most foreign policy officials, if you like, has tended to look at aspects related to the rules of the game. So more the space that I think officials and diplomats and so on are quite comfortable, which is the negotiations, the discussions about the very broad macro issues around global economic governance and so forth. And I don't actually think we've done too badly in that front, to tell you the truth. If I was to consider South Africa's development in this regard, I think in many aspects we have continued to play a very active role in many different institutional contexts and on many different debates, and even in the times we're in now with the COVID-19 pandemic, you've seen South Africa sort of taking up issues around things like debt relief and so on in the G20 context, which I would put as part of a sort of a very broad economic diplomacy set of issues. I think where it becomes more complex is when we start to think about what some people term as commercial diplomacy. And this is where challenges such as making sure that there is very close coordination, not only between government actors and the private sector, but also within government departments, because we still have that distinction in the South African context between trade and investment on the one hand, the Department of DTIC, and foreign policy in DIRCO. And this has been a notoriously difficult space, if you like, to find clearly defined, mutually supportive actions that would really assist with commercial diplomacy activities. And so I think that there's some issues around internal government development of positions in this space. And then you come to the private sector. And traditionally, the private sector in the South African context is much more comfortable to interact with departments such as the DTIC, or even National Treasury, SARS, for example, is much more a natural fit in many ways. DIRCO, I think, because their focus tends to be much higher level, has not always been an easy space for the private sector to navigate. And the private sector itself is something that I'm throwing the term around very loosely here, but it is not one homogeneous group. And I think that that's what we really need to keep in mind, is that there are many different actors at many different sizes, at many different levels in the economy, with many different interests in terms of how South Africa interacts beyond its borders. So for example, the space that I'm quite familiar with, where I spend a fair bit of time still, is in the NEDLAC context, which is where you will have the official social dialogue platform on, for example, trade issues. But the representatives in that NEDLAC context tend to be more the protectionists leaning parts of the private sector, if you like. There's a lot of representatives there from traditional manufacturing sectors, agriculture, for example, but services companies don't tend to have much of a voice in NEDLAC. This is a frustration. It's been a frustration for decades that the companies you're talking about, Sanusha, who often have been the leading face of South African investment in the rest of the continent, are predominantly services-based players, and they are not particularly well organized, except perhaps with the exception of the banks. They don't tend to find it so easy to engage with government actors, because the regulation and the rules around services, trade and investment are much more dispersed and complex. You're going to have a lot of players involved. So for example, if you're operating in the space of, say, being an online based service provider such as a very large corporate like an Apple or so forth coming into the South African market, you're going to be interacting with probably close to maybe 10, 12 different government agencies, regulators and departments to understand the environment that you're working in. And so I think those are just some of the reasons why we have still not cracked the ideal situation of engagement around services issues. And this continues to be something that dogs the finding of a mutually agreeable approach to issues such as commercial diplomacy. You've raised some questions about why investment is becoming harder in the rest of the continent, and I don't have definitive answers for this. I think that's a really great topic for some research, to tell you the truth, because the work that we do, for example, through the business school context at the Wits Business School, when we look at some of these case studies, is we can drill down at an individual level to explore, for example, why the Tiger Brands investment into Nigeria was not successful. But I don't think we get a bigger sense of the overall political environment when we focus in at that firm level. And I think that overall political environment does need to be taken into account. You mentioned, for example, the competition aspects. Are we really aware of what the competitive space is in many sectors and in many of the other African countries at the moment? Are we aware of evolution in policy and perception around foreign direct investment, not just coming from South Africa? Are we taking into account the lag in the demographic dividend, for example? You know, there was a lot of hype about Africa rising, and a lot of that was based on the changing demographics, but there is definitely a lag in that. So there's all sorts of, I think, quite high level macro questions that you could ask about why investors are struggling in certain contexts. And I think for me, this would link to my last point that I'd want to make at this stage, and that is that understanding these things is going to be critical if we are to translate the political momentum behind the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that's currently being negotiated to a reality on the ground. And my concern is that is one area that we are seeing where we could in fact make real progress in bringing more private sector voices into not only South Africa's foreign policy, but engagements at the broader level of the continent as well. Otherwise, we're going to find that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is just a whole lot of big wishful thinking, if we cannot actually explore how that framework will translate into concrete implementation by business. So I think that that's an area of great potential and possibility at the moment for specific engagement between government officials and the private sector more broadly. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I mean, I think you've given us a fantastic compact overview of what's going on. Commercial diplomacy is really one of those areas that I think we constantly come back to. But I want you to just mull over this question, because I think Arina wants to also come in. But there's this question I have on border management, the border management issues with regard to Home Affairs, and how much of that is a critical dimension of South African foreign policy, but more in the context of how foreign policy is being managed at the borders. Because, you know, in economic theory and in macroeconomic issues and with foreign direct investment, I mean, you and I have had these conversations many a time. What happens at the border, what happens behind the border is very important. And just to think about that in terms of when we look at the commercial diplomacy and the services, we're looking at the big, broad macro picture. But a lot of the issues are subnational, are micro issues. You know, what happens at the subnational level. So just give us a bit of your input around some of those questions that may be coming up, not just in NEDLAC, but just, you know, more broadly around the Border Management Act, the implementation of it, and what does it mean for foreign policy, because it also means that there's a reaction to South Africa from outside because of the Border Management Act. But I'll give Arina a chance to give her input, and then you have some time to just mull over that. Arina?
Thanks, Sanusha. It's good to see you, Catherine. Thanks for making it. And I also just want to link this to the fact that we're discussing the internal, external, dynamics of foreign policy, but also as Catherine is speaking, we're looking at addressing the bigger gap in addressing the kind of mechanics or a how-to guide linking to, Sanusha's comment in question, and rather building this kind of institutional memory. I mean, in this, it would be incredibly important for those wanting to pursue investment, wanting to pursue trade, or just commercial diplomacy in general, in a broader sense. What is the status of the bilateral agreement between two countries? What are the kind of legal requirements in place, the institutional changes? What kind of permits are required? What offices does it need to go into? Actual how to import, export duties, waiting periods, and have this even translated, have this accessible. Now, my vision is that there is a potential, for our missions, to gather this kind of information and share it for someone else to put together, or maybe that this knowledge already exists, but it needs to become more accessible. And this could also contribute to a greater rationalization of having assets abroad and in respective countries and making more strategic use of them. But that's just something I wanted to add. Over to you, Catherine. Thanks.
Go ahead, Catherine.
Thanks, Sanusha. Thanks, Arina. Yes, the BMA, it's something Sanusha and I have spent quite a lot of time thinking about over the last few years, because for many of you, perhaps who don't work directly in the trade space or in the context of home affairs, the Border Management Authority has been on the cards now for a number of years, but it has only been recently that the President signed the Border Management Authority Act into force. So we're now in a phase of negotiating the implementation protocol for the BMA before the promulgation of the Act will take place. And it's a really interesting example, as Sanusha says, because it may sound like something very technical in many ways, but I think from a foreign policy point of view, it's a reflection of that tension between security concerns and economic issues. And the BMA enables those tensions to be played out in a way that is worthy of study, I think, because what effectively we're doing with the BMA is handing over control of the borders around South Africa, starting with a priority sort of number of about, probably they're targeting maybe 11, but I don't think that will be possible with budgetary constraints. So priority borders initially will be handed over for coordination and control by the Department of Home Affairs, which I think speaks a lot to the way that borders are viewed by the South African government, the priority that's been placed on the operation of those borders, which is effectively to manage the movement of people and to deal with security concerns that are attached to the movement of people, such as illegal and illicit trade and so forth. So we've decided to go down this road, and it's not uncommon. It's something, for example, that the US has done, Australia as well have done this, but neither of those countries really deal with the same challenges that we as South Africa face in the context of the number of land borders that we have, the importance of those land borders from an economic point of view, not just from a security point of view. And so what's key for me is how are we going to balance these economic concerns? Because on the one hand, we're creating a BMA that is going to be driven by a particular ideology, if you like, or a particular approach. And then on the other hand, we're talking about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We're talking about green lane corridors across the African continent to enable the fast and expedited movement of goods. And are we going to be able to strike that balance in implementation? And this is something that certainly we're working on a lot with engagements with, for example, SARS. But one of the points I think about the BMA is that from a foreign policy perspective, there's been little communication about this move in the South African context with our neighbours. So this is where, for example, the Southern African Customs Union weaknesses come into play. For me, the Southern African Customs Union is one of the most overlooked structures that we have from both an economic and foreign policy point of view in the South African context. And if we are not communicating about things like the BMA, for example, to our SACU neighbours, to our SADC neighbours as well, with the Beitbridge border post, for example, being completely critical to north-south interactions, then we are making a mistake in terms of simply pushing ahead with what we are identifying as a national set of priorities without taking into account regional considerations. And I think that that's something that I believe is a challenge in many different ways in the context of South African foreign policy, is that we speak a language about regional integration and so forth, but we often will simply take decisions here from a national lens without the appropriate communication to our neighbours. And I'm a bit concerned that we are facing a possible tit-for-tat situation with some of our SACU partners and possibly our SADC neighbours as well. We've seen just in the last week or so, Botswana, for example, has closed the border to baked goods, which is part of their attempt to create opportunities for small and medium-sized businesses within the Botswana context. But it obviously goes against the whole objectives of being members of a customs union. So I think that we're in quite a sort of fragile space in terms of some of these key regional relationships, and initiatives like the BMA provide us a lens through which to try and understand better some of these dynamics. I hope that made some sense and answered your questions, Sanusha.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I mean, it really did, because I think the other thing that we keep coming up with regard to our conversation in this webinar is the question of national interest. And the BMA is it a national interest driven kind of approach without necessarily considering that there are broader dynamics around, like you say, SACU, the ACFTA, but also in the context of just the fact that with our regional value chains, production, etc. If we're going to have if Botswana is going to close their border around baked goods to us, what does this mean? So the incoherence between what's happening in Parliament with regard to legislation, which you and I both know this is legislation coming from the previous administration, which is a hangover effect, and so they're kind of rushing through some of this legislation. But what are the implications for South African foreign policy, national economic interests, the commercial diplomacy, and so forth? And I'm glad you raised it in that way, and I think it does deserve a whole kind of seminar of its own to unpack. But what I want to now turn to is the more broader
Can I add one point on that, Sanusha, because I think that it comes down to also some of what we're seeing playing out now at the moment between Zimbabwe and South Africa. Mm-hmm. And I think, a large part of what drove the BMA process originally was the concern around the weaknesses of that border between Zimbabwe and South Africa. That was definitely something. If you read, for example, the impact assessment reports and so on the original proposed BMA, there was a lot of the concern was very much just that one particular border. And again, for me, it speaks to to our whole approach to that relationship as part of our foreign policy with Zimbabwe, and striking that balance between security interests, if you like, or what I would just call broadly security interests, but for example, concerns about people movement and so on, with what is the economic reality. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting point at the moment. If you were to have a further discussion about BMA, is perhaps also looking at it in that context of the South Africa-Zimbabwe relationship as well.
I completely agree. And as one of the participants asked, what is it valuable? Does South Africa can afford to have a security kind of approach and the economic implications? But also, the subtext, all of this is whether this is one way you deal with xenophobia as well.
Right.
So, another issue that impacts on our foreign policy. But if I turn the discussion a little bit now to, you mentioned G20, and I will get Arina, Philani, and Faith on this as well. But just on the G20, and you said we did make some important footprint with regard to the debt relief measures and so forth. What do you see from a kind of economic perspective with our role in BRICS, trying to move into some of these bigger multilateral institutions? Are we now caught in a bit of a stagnant role? Are we getting there? Is it still going to be business as usual? Mind the pun again. Just your impressions from a kind of multilateral with regard to not just the G20, but the more broader kind of business footprint that we have with regard to where we are, maybe a political economy kind of approach as opposed to a purely economic one.
Yeah, that's a complex question, and to tell you the truth, I would have to admit at the outset I haven't done much thinking about BRICS for the last few months. I think for me, BRICS is a really complex relationship from a South African. I think that if we were to look at BRICS from the perspective of the original agenda, which was to push for a reform of global economic governance architectures and institutions, to accept a changed reality in terms of the roles of some of the BRICS countries in an economic sense, then I think that agenda is still very valid, and possibly increasingly by the day, to tell you the truth. And so we should probably still be pursuing that as part of a BRICS grouping. But then we've always had to balance on the other side of that the commercial realities of aspects that you alluded to earlier, for example, with regards to competition amongst BRICS players in the context of the rest of the African continent, for example. And it's interesting. I think from a trade point of view, what I'm seeing increasingly is that South Africa is still very strongly aligned to India. So the South Africa-India positions on trade issues remain very, very, very tightly aligned. That's been very clear throughout the whole series of discussions that have been taking place, for example, in the World Trade Organization during this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. But we haven't seen a broader set of sort of BRICS positions coming out. And I think what's going to be more critical from the point of view of that relationship is not BRICS as a group, but how US-China relationships evolve and move forward, and how South Africa strikes a balance between its relationships with China on the one hand, including through the BRICS, and the US on the other. So I know that there's other people in this group that have probably done a lot more thinking about those issues than me, and I would be interested much more in that sort of dynamic of how South Africa responds from a foreign policy perspective to that bilateral relationship, if you like.
Just to think about when I come back, just around some of the questions, and we spoke about BRICS earlier as well, and where South Africa features, relationship with the EU, again, important of the way the EU is finding its traction between maybe not getting caught in these wins that are in terms of the bilateral between the US and China, and more importantly, I think the question around the US itself with AGOA. I know you've been doing some work on that as well, more in the context of maybe to turn around Peter Vale's question. You know, if the ANC loses power tomorrow, what happens to foreign policy? Well, what happens with the election in the US to AGOA, not just for South Africa, but the broader context within that? Let me bring in Philani here and ask him, you know, he's been following the BRICS, South Africa's BRICS involvement with regard to the Russian presidency, and just some of the impressions you're getting out of the work and in the academic forum and so forth, where South Africa is positioning itself, and what are some of the perspectives that are coming out about key issues around, one, the economic governance agenda, but more broadly as well on the global governance agenda.
Sure. I think what's interesting, Sanusha, with the BRICS is that some of the political parties that, you know, let's say India and in Brazil, is that some of the political parties that have historically worked, you know, very closely with the ANC and also with or at least who were leading their respective countries when organizations such as IPSA and BRICS were formed, are no longer in power. So that has a different dimension when it comes to party-to-party relations, but certainly at a state-to-state level, I think that hasn't had an explicit impact yet. Obviously, COVID-19 definitely, I think, took some momentum from Russia's envisioned hosting, you know, of the summit, which it had seen as hosting also in conjunction with the Eurasian Economic Union, but also looking at also your Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So I think what's been important there is that at a state-to-state level is that relations have continued. And despite the fact that we've seen, you know, this tension between also India and China, is that what we've seen is that within BRICS discussions, is that the member states have always tried to discuss the issues that they do agree on and to keep out of the agenda issues where they are, you know, where they haven't found each other yet. And we saw this at the BRICS summit, which was hosted by China, I think. I think just before that summit, also there was some border tension between India and China. And they tried to contain that so that it doesn't affect, you know, the actual summit. So, I mean, a lot of discussions have been taking place, I think, more online. I think last week there was a meeting of the BRICS, or at least in South Africa, there were some planning meetings for the BRICS Academic Forum. So at least South African scholars working on BRICS have started to meet and to coordinate some of the research endeavors that they are involved in. But then also, I think for South Africa, the most important thing right now within the BRICS has been the operationalization of the new development bank's Africa Regional Center. And we've seen that South Africa has used that facility, so has accessed you know, $1 billion from that facility. It can still access another $1 billion if it so chooses later in the year, because each of the BRICS countries have access to $2 billion. So that has been more important. And I think that's also been important because it's created an expectation within the immediate region that the BRICS New Development Bank will also start lending beyond just the BRICS members. So I think it's important in that regard. And I think that's where, at least for South Africa, the focus will remain around institutionalizing aspects of the BRICS partnership, particularly around the new development bank and its potential role within the African continent. Because I think there's a realization that, yes, if used properly, it could also be used to finance some of the regional programs within, or some of the regional infrastructure projects within SACU and SADC. And I think that's really the strategic thinking, at least from the South African side, so that even whilst you've got changes in the domestic politics of BRICS members, is that you still have a functioning BRICS partnership.
Thanks, Philani. Francis, you are back with us. Francis Kornegay, you want to basically make a few points on the issue of the BRICS. Francis? Just unmute your mic, Francis.
Yeah, Francis might be having an issue with his mic, I think.
Yeah, let me go to Arina in the meantime while we sort out Francis's technical issue. Arina, you wanted to speak about BRICS as well. Some of your impressions?
Thanks, Sanusha. So just to add on to what Philani and Catherine have been saying, I mean, we spoke about not much going on in terms of thinking on BRICS. So it's been a bit quiet, but they're still going on ahead with these kind of proceedings in spite of the pandemic. And what I want to specifically focus on is at the end of the Brazilian term, there was a commitment to better link the business track of diplomacy to the workings of the new development bank. And this also links to the fact that the bank is commercial, and while the loans have been sovereign backed, there is an understanding that there is scope for public-private partnerships in these kind of developments. So you see this kind of opening up in what the bank was to achieve. And this links me to another question. Where is the BRICS going? What's next? Maybe not in the immediate future, but rather future projects, is the NDB can be more of a litmus test of how the BRICS is going to expand in itself. There has been discussion on, the trajectories of a BRICS plus type of cooperation. And this could be a very measured way in taking on new membership on how the BRICS partnership can expand in a very controlled environment. So you see this regionalized strategy. I mean, from the onset, the BRICS was very clear that they see a number of regional leadership positions, or not rather positions, but regional leadership roles for the BRICS, and what that means for a global rethinking of what kind of dynamics we are experiencing and what kind of paradigm thinking there is. So you see this kind of moving towards a regionalization strategy in the expansion of BRICS, as we're seeing with the development of your regional centers, specifically to be launched. I think the rest of them are going to be launched this year. And you are starting to look at how the bank is going to exploit these kind of potential synergies that already exist between, the BRICS, NDB, regional financial memberships as well. So when I say you have the NDB, but then you also have the regional memberships of other countries to other IFIs. Are we going to start to see better coordination of international financial institutions in this regard? That could be a nice spin on how global self-financing is actually understood, which is a nice segue for the BRICS to add more value. But yeah.
Francis, you want to add your point?
If I may, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear, Francis.
Okay, well, finally, I'm this has been a very frustrating morning, but let me just say that I think that given the chaotic situation in global politics at the moment, I think that there really has to be some urgent rethinking of BRICS and how we relate to it, because the intra-BRICS relations between countries are very complicated, and I think that may mean that we really have to go back to the some of the original economic governance and financial relations emphasis that motivated BRICS coming into being in the first place. Because here I think there may be room for more pragmatism in terms of how BRICS countries relate to each other, because the geopolitics within BRICS is just very problematic and toxic, and so I think one of the problems with BRICS is that by the time that South Africa really got into BRICS, BRICS was all over the place, basically. And I have never thought that BRICS really had the kind of focus that it should in terms of the way South Africa relates to it. But then that also brings in some of the other issues that Catherine brought up, which once I was able to get unfocused on my technical problems, I think some of the comments that she made about our regional approach is really something that needs to be taken into very urgent consideration by everyone, because it seems to me that you really need to have a government private sector dialogue both at the national and the regional level, because the problems in terms of BMA, and it was good to be able to get into the discussion when it got around to that. I think that unless there's an urgency in sorting out these issues, I don't think we're going to go anywhere fast. And the thing is that within the African Continental Free Trade Area, there is that Cape to Cairo component. Now, unless we can get the Cape to Cairo trilateral FTA working, then we're basically looking at a Potemkin village when we consider the future of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And I think the frustration that I had is that I just don't see at the political level, whether it's the ANC, the government, whatever, I don't see the sense of urgency that is required. Now, on the other side, in terms of how other countries relate to Africa and South Africa, I know I myself have been trying to promote within the context of US policy the need to regionalize American foreign policy towards Africa. You had the very limited period in which there was, for example, a SADC US forum, which didn't last very long because of the Zimbabwe situation. But you see, this has implications, regionalizing has implications for other areas. For example, the regionalization of AGOA. If one is looking at the future of AGOA, in the context of promoting the African continental free trade area, there has to be a major regionalizing component. And here, you know, and Catherine, you know, very aptly pointed out the relation between India and South Africa. Now, on Monday, I'm going to be in a webinar that the Diplomatist is having on India's relationship to both COMESA and SADC. Now, the interesting thing about that is that unlike other external actors, India actually seems to have as a component of its Africa policy a fairly clearly defined regionalizing component, which is what I think a number of other external actors ought to have. But on the other hand, the flip side of that is that Africa ought to actually be taking the initiative in dictating those kinds of terms. You know, one can promote a U.S. regionalization of its relations with Africa, but Africa, the AU, major countries like South Africa, Nigeria, etc., ought to actually be proactively taking the initiative in coming up with those kinds of you know, recommendations. And I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Francis. I think those are very informative. And I think you kind of also cut into some of what Brooke Spector's raising about the utility of BRICS going forward. I mean, is it really going to be one that's going to expand, given the fact that there is a dominance of China? That we also didn't mention the fact that the subgrouping in BRICS, the Russia, India, China component, is much more an important architecture that informs some of the dynamics of the BRICS.
Yeah.
So this is going to be critical. But I want to actually just, you know, take the discussion now, because we're coming to the end. We have about 8 minutes, and Francis, you still need to speak about Sonotica, which I'll give you a chance at the end. But just to get some closing remarks from Arina, from Catherine, Faith, and of course Philani, you'll do the closing, so you can add your comments there. But just to give the three panelists the opportunity now to just make some closing remarks in terms of some of the dynamics that emerged from this webinar. And I apologize, we can't cover everything, but definitely we can set up future webinars to focus on some of the issues that were coming out that need to be explored on. Let me start with Faith.
Thanks, Sanusha. So in the interest of time, I'll keep it very brief. I think three concluding remarks for me on what we've been discussing today. Number one is the imperative of sorting out the state party dynamics and the kind of outsized influence that it has on foreign policy. The second point is that there should be much more commitment, not just from a resources perspective, but also from a research perspective, on South Africa's drive to craft an independent foreign policy. And this is linked to the broader questions on how it will also ventilate these issues from the perspective of coherence and correspondence. So those are important aspects. And also the question of a foreign policy constituency, particularly in a participatory democracy, the role that parliament ought to play, the role that civil society and other non-state actors also play. And lastly, it's the ability of South Africa to learn from its mistakes, to learn from its criticisms, and to build on its successes, and to build on its institutional memory in very strategic multilateral forums such as the UN Security Council tenures. I think I'm going to leave it at that with those 3 points.
Thank you. Arina?
Thanks, Sanusha. I'm going to try and keep it even shorter. For me, it's just 2 points. It's about, well, foreign policy is much more meaningful to the domestic agenda than its current state of implementation. So we are seeing that there is an urgency to domesticate foreign policy much faster than it's being currently driven. And then to add, you know, going past state party dynamics or party state dynamics, it's a sense of translating and going past this wait and see relationship that bureaucrats and the state seem to be cloistered in, and they're not seeming to be able to move past that and to take longer term decisions. But that's it from me, and I'm looking forward to engaging with everyone after the event. And yeah, that's it. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Arina. Catherine?
Thanks, Sanusha. I think most points have actually been covered. I was just trying to think of anything else I wanted to add, but I guess I would just reiterate the fact that I think that foreign policy has tended over the last few years in the South African context to be seen simply as the role of DIRCO. And I think what's critical is that we get back to some coordination at a national level around key issues, both with other key government departments and with other actors, especially the private sector when it comes to commercial and economic diplomacy. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you. And thank you for sharing those thoughts, and definitely going to take you up on the BMA and other issues. But I think what I want to also just say that there were questions that came through that were really good and helped us to inform the discussion. I mean, particularly around, you know, the national interest. How do you define it? Is it conceptual? Is it analytical? How do you find synergies between the domestic and the international? Are we looking too inward in our domestic environment and informing our foreign policy? The questions around progressive internationalism. And I think there was a very interesting point raised by Dr. Shamazi, who asked the question, you know, how do we conceptualize South African foreign policy in the context of, is it a foreign policy that is a mixture of realism and pragmatism? Do we see the Mandela years and the Mbeki years respectively in that kind of a construct, and how do we describe the Zuma and Ramaphosa policy? I think the Ramaphosa policy is trying to get some kind of traction back to a mix between the pragmatism and what our constitution is all about. But I think we are finding difficulties because of structural changes. So I don't want to take up too much of time. We've got about 3 minutes. We want Francis to give us his Zoonotica input and tell everyone about the Zoonotica series. I'm going to hand back to Arina, who's going to bring this to a close. And I thank you all, and please look out for our policy brief and whatever the recordings that will be available to participants. Thank you, and I appreciate all the comments and feedback.
Thanks, Sanusha. From my side, I want to say a big thank you, to the panelists, to everyone who's stuck with us, especially also to our sponsor and partner, Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung. But let me rather hand over to Philani, who can have the last word, and then we'll do Francis. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Arina. So Faith had 3 points, Arina had 2 points, and I'm going to make it 1 point. And my 1 point just draws, I think, from what Dr. Moyo said earlier, that we need to guard against the strive to look at foreign policy in an overly nationalistic manner, driven by the pandemic, and that it drives societies to be internally looking. We've seen some interesting investigative journalism of late, which has been looking at how, for instance, in South Africa, how the discourse around immigration and the discourse around the region has really been driven by sponsored, accounts and bots, which have really been trying to push a particular narrative. And that narrative leads to more, it doesn't lead to a cohesive approach when it comes to South Africa's role in the region. So I think an opportunity for COVID-19 is to actually use it not to strengthen just national capacity, but to strengthen the regional approach to international relations, to strengthen regional organizations, and to build the resilience through regional value chains. And I think because these pandemics are something, or something of this nature is something that is unfortunately something that is actually going to be a more, or at least it's going to occur more often. And therefore, I think as a continent, we need to build resilience to make sure that when the next pandemic hits, we're not at the back of the global line, but that we do have the regional production chains where we can actually begin to be manufacturing some of our own health equipment and a whole range of other things. And I think looking at, you know, some of your inputs around the continental free trade area and what Francis looked at around the tripartite free trade area, those present opportunities to really build resilience at a regional level. I think let me just leave it there.
I think let's have a word from Francis on zoonotica. Thanks, Francis.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Arina. Yeah, and I'm gonna try to cut my comments short in the interest of time. But I think that that Philani's comments provide a good way into understanding the motivation behind zoonotica. Zoonotica really has more to do with international relations in general, in terms of how not just South Africa, but other countries may have to navigate the international terrain in light of the pandemic and its implications. Zoonotica, because of this, is basically futuristic in its intent, in its aims. This is because the pandemic has basically fragmented the global landscape, already experiencing resurgent nationalisms, so that it can be argued that it has also further called into question the sovereignty of nation states, if not the nation state itself, so that a more resilient world order may force a greater consolidation of humanity into more integrated regional and continental supranational communities that run against the grain of reactionary nationalist resurgence. Because this is the contradiction that we're looking at now, both in Africa and globally, is that while there is more of there has been this nationalist resurgence, its contradiction is contradicted by the reality of the fact that the world is interdependent. So you have that contradiction that the pandemic, I think, has really accentuated. So the IGD Zoonotica series is inspired by a sense that we must now look to the future and become more futuristic in efforts to discern where the world is going. How does this new era of zoonotic disruption affect the international system as we have known it, international relations and the global geopolitical, economic, social, and cultural landscapes? How will it affect our changing African landscape, and particularly regionally, as we've been discussing? Does it compel us to accelerate regional and continental integration towards a more Pan-African reality? I would say it does. I mean, if we really appreciate what is before us. Or does it portend return to a Hobbesian existence of all against all? Indeed, how might such a reversion unfold among a humanity on its way to a global population of 10 billion or more by mid-century? And of course, the African demographic dynamic is a major factor in that. It might be that we have to to conceptualize or reconceptualize a more biospheric global commons international relations and security studies paradigm, including the economic implications within that, factoring in the multiple dimensions of climate change, not only emissions, but deforestation and pollution of the oceans, in protecting and rewilding land and marine habitats, along with sanctioning mechanisms that might take the form of a United Nations environmental peer review mechanism. Thinking through and engaging these issues of the suddenly changing here and now into the unfolding future offers an opportunity for us to rethink our reality going forward. As such, IGD invites everyone to visit our website for more information on this new series. And if the mood strikes you, we would hope it, as we hope it will, to engage us with think piece commentaries on where you think we are going or where we should be headed, or what the new international, including African landscape, may look like or should look like. We invite you to be adventurous and prescriptive. In other words, enrich our global dialogue by discerning the future. Such contributions can be anywhere from 500 to as much as 2,000 words, as we let our imaginations take us on such a journey. So I think I will end it there. But I think in conclusion, I think the kind of discussion that we have had today against the backdrop of the pandemic reinforces why we have this series. And with that, I will conclude my remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. And
Okay.
with that, we are going to close. Please look out for our webinar report and policy briefs that will be coming out shortly, and we hope to engage you in the future. We will be following up with you just to see where you think we can improve and what kind of content you'd also like us to engage on as well. But with that, thank you very much for joining us, and see you in the future.